Well, we divided the evaluation into findings, conclusions, and recommendations. But to be very brief, the first finding was that as the largest donor in Palestine, the EU has been reliable, consistent. It has underpinned stability. It has provided for the welfare of the Palestinian people. It has preserved and built capacity for the Palestinian Authority institutions, and through its support to UNRWA has been, again, a consistent and reliable partner in providing for the welfare of Palestinian refugees. These accomplishments are very significant, and we find that they stand alone in their merits. Having said that, we also took a broader look first at the context and then at the cooperation within the context, because all programs of cooperation have a very particular context. And in this case, the context is really quite unique. Unlike almost all other programs of cooperation, that with Palestine is not with a state with full sovereignty or full span of control over its population, its territory, its resources. The Palestinian Authority, the primary partner for the cooperation, has a very limited span of control, primarily in the West Bank. Sharing the span of control is Israel for security, movement, resources, but also UNRWA for health and education services, Hamas in Gaza, which provides a number of public services, also health, education, security, donors who provide funding and who provide consultants and work closely, also provide substantial resources, and therefore, in a sense, directly and indirectly provide services. So the complexity of the context is quite significant in terms of what could be expected in terms of results. That made for a very complicated evaluation. In looking at the overall context, we took a 20-year look because we thought that any snapshot which was less time-bound would not necessarily give a proper picture. So we took the period of the Oslo process, which began roughly 20 years ago. When we looked at almost all the sector indicators, when we looked at the economy, we found a pattern of overall decline relative to 1994. That's in terms of productive private sector-driven investment and employment. We looked at unemployment rates, youth participation rates. We looked at fiscal stability, fiscal sustainability, fiscal deficits. By all of these factors, the Palestinian economy and the Palestinian socioeconomic situation has really declined. The one area where it has been more or less stable, however, and significantly, is in the area of human development, that is health and education. We couldn't verify substantial improvements, but nevertheless, the indicators relative to the region and relative to the Palestinian situation over 20 years have been more or less stable. But we also had to note some very negative features, which included in particular a deep and entrenched donor dependency, a hollowed out economy which would not be capable of providing sustainability. We looked at these factors against the stated political goals of the European Union, which is an independent Palestinian state, viable, providing democratic good governance and contiguous, living side by side with a secure state of Israel. When we looked at those overarching goals of the European Union, it has to be said that those goals are perhaps less attainable today, or they appear less attainable today than they did 20 years ago. And certainly even looking at the evaluation period of 2008 to 2013, these goals appear less attainable. So this is a rather anomalous situation. So the findings and conclusions, to summarize a bit, show that the EU has underpinned stability but that there's also been a lack of coherence between declared policy and the practice on the ground, particularly with respect to the EU's overall political goals. We also concluded that the EU's goals to democratic good governance also were somewhat limited. At the beginning of the evaluation period in 2008, the direct financial support was viewed as a temporary emergency provisions to stand up the PA and continue to provide basic support to the Palestinians at a time of political turmoil. However, what was temporary in 2007-8 seems to have become permanent. In the meantime, the Palestinian Authority's political mandate expired a few years ago, and at the same time, legislative oversight and the Palestinian people's oversight has been absent over these years. The result is there has been an accountability deficit, was the way we put it. And we don't mean only to a legislative body, but in the absence of a legislative body, we mean to the civil society organizations, municipality, but basically the people for whom this cooperation is ultimately aimed. This lack of accountability, again, over time, runs counter to the European goals of good governance. And finally, we looked at the programs within the cooperation, and we found that while many of them had been effective in providing the goals that were intended in 2008, 2009, again, over time, we found a number of implementation deficits. But those implementation deficits could be summed up as a lack of result and performance monitoring and results-oriented project and programs. And in that respect, we felt that the continuation of the overall cooperation, given all of these factors, had basically run its course, as we say. That is, it reached the limits of what it can do. Of course, you can continue doing this by providing stability, by taking care of the welfare of the Palestinian people, but for the political goals, state, contiguous, viable, democratic good governance, our conclusions were that the cooperation in its present form would not contribute further toward those political goals. So those were the findings and the conclusions, more or less, of the report. There were many second-level findings and conclusions, and of course these reports are quite large, and there's quite a bit of details, which hopefully will be of interest and use to the people working in those areas. But that's an overall view.